The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
The space race between the US and the USSR was one of the defining moments of the 20th century. One of the key players in the space race were women. However, because of the culture of times, women were severely underrepresented and oftentimes left out of the history books. Because of the work that they did during the space race, the US was able to put a man on the moon. Even though their work has notoriously gone largely unknown and underappreciated, they paved the way for future generations of women in the field of space exploration. The space race was an indirect result of Germany's surrender at the end of World War II. At that time, only the United States possessed atomic weapons to help discourage Soviet communist expansion. As the Soviets saw the US advancement, they developed their own weapons, and it soon became a race to prove which country had superior weapons. They wanted to take it one step farther, being in control of space, in order to control nuclear missiles from up there, making it easier to launch a surprise missile. Soon enough, the first intercontinental ballistic missile was developed. This event startled the world, giving the impression that America was behind the Soviets in science and technology. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite capable of orbiting Earth. A month later, Sputnik 2 went up, carrying a bigger payload and a passenger, Laika the rocket dog. She proved that a living being could survive spaceflight. Scrambling to catch up, the US launched its own satellite, Explorer 1, in January of 1958, but the USSR was firmly in the lead. During John F. Kennedy's speech, he says, "We have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destructions, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding." He made it the goal of the decade. He wanted to be the first on the moon and protect space. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets pulled even farther ahead, launching the first human into orbit, Yuri Gagarin. A few weeks later, on May 5, 1961, American Alan Shepard reached space in Freedom 7, but it was almost a year until John Glenn fully orbited Earth. Meanwhile, the Russians ranked up more and more. They launched the first dual-man flight, the first woman in space, the first three-man flight. For Americans, the Soviet Union was the enemy, and the enemy was winning. The US was in need of a big comeback, so they focused on one bright finish line, putting a man on the moon. But it will be done, John F. Kennedy says, and it will be done before the end of this decade. And so the Apollo Lunar program began. Although the $25 billion investment was risky, the potential payoff was huge. It could mean victory in the world's eyes, a triumph for American democracy. On July 20th, 1969, just 6 months before the end of the decade, Apollo 11 landed on the moon at the eyes of millions of people. They listened as Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon's surface. As they celebrated this momentous achievement of NASA's Apollo program and the men who risked their lives by flying to the moon, we forgot about the women that made it possible. During the Apollo era, women played crucial roles in getting the astronauts to the moon and back home safely. They designed spacecraft, calculated flight trajectories, engineered software, helped with astronaut training, monitored astronaut vital signs during spaceflight, and more. Their names may not be as well known as their male counterparts, but these women's contributions were just as important to the success of the Apollo mission. In 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong marked his historical achievement with the words, "That's one small step for men, one giant leap for mankind." His now famous transmission was heard around the globe thanks to NASA's Deep Space Network, which made communication from outer space possible. That network was built by a woman named Suzanne Finley. She was part of an all-female team of coders whose work was integral to the success of the Apollo 11 mission. Another woman in the group, Margaret Hamilton, wrote the code that actually made the lunar landing possible. The network this group of women worked on is still used today for all of NASA's space communication. In addition, seamstresses like Eleanor Foraker sewed the astronauts' metal and plastic spacesuits by hand. There was a movie based on the untold story of the black women mathematicians who helped win the space race. The female focuses on 3 real-life African-American female pioneers, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson. The women were meticulous and accurate, and they didn't have to pay them very much, NASA's historian Bill Berry says, explaining NACA's decision. While they did the same work as their male counterparts, African-American computers were paid less. They were relegated to the segregated west section of the Langley campus, where they had to use separate dining and bathroom facilities. Despite having the same education, they had to retake college courses they had already passed, and were often never considered for promotions or jobs within NACA. Hidden Figure despites the scene in which computer Mary Jackson is asked if she wants to be an engineer if she were a white male. One of Johnson's first assignments was computing the trajectories for Ellen Shepard's historical flight in 1961. Johnson had to trace out Freedom 7's exact path from liftoff to splashdown. John Glenn did not completely trust the computer, so he asked the head engineers to get the girl to check the numbers. If she says the numbers are good, I'm ready to go. The space agency's exclusive male persona sparked feminist debates about opportunities for women. Women began to complain that there were only male astronauts and began to protest against NASA, who fell back on the argument that to test women's bodies for spaceflight would require changing the stimulators and redesigning the spacesuits, which would cost a lot of money and put them farther behind the Russians. They also insisted that women's bodies were too fragile and that menstrual cycle will make them unfit for space. Women groups like NOW began to protest the all-male astronaut corps. NOW encouraged women to succeed, to fight for what they wanted, for what they believed. Women like Katherine Johnson, who graduated college and excelled as a math major. Women like Frances Northcutt, who arrived at NASA Houston campus in 1965, eager to join the space race, but soon learned that NASA men were engineers and women computers, or human computers, with less status and less pay. But Frances Northcutt became the first female engineer to work in NASA's mission control. She calculated return to Earth trajectories, starting with Apollo 8, and helped retrieve the astronauts who narrowly survived Apollo 13 disaster. Northcutt stayed on as NASA's contractor until 1973. By then, she recalled, there were a lot of women in mission control. Just seeing women involved made a difference. The following year, she served as the city of Houston's first women's advocate, promoting legislation and executive actions that allowed women to serve as police and firefighters. It's been a while since the space race, and so many things have changed. There are women in all types of jobs now. Here in 2020, there were 2 women at the International Space Station from March 14, 2019 until February 6, 2020. NASA astronaut Christina Nauch and Jessica Meir landed back on Earth, ending a record-breaking 328 days in space, the longest stretch for women of any nationality. They made history, performing the first all-female spacewalk in the history of space travel.
At the same time, we recognize that it is a historic achievement, and we do, of course, want to give credit to all of those that came before us. There has been a long line of female scientists, explorers, engineers, and astronauts, and we have followed in their footsteps to get us where we are today.
What we're doing now shows all the work that went in for the decades prior, all of the women that worked to get us here, where we are today, Meir said. 2019 could be called the year of women. Another example of how far the agency has come. Just a few weeks ago, when NASA announced its honor awards, its highest form of recognition to employees and contractors, in total 42 people were honored, all but 2 were men. It is not what we would like it to be, but we have made progress. From women who were severely underrepresented and left out of the history books because they had jobs like sewing. But even so, women continue to strive for success.
Women. It's been 100 years that we've had the right to vote this year. So this year, while we celebrate that, we also check another box, women doing spacewalk. And the next one, the big one, is for us to walk on the moon.
Since then, more than 40 American women have entered space, and now they're planning on having the first to walk on the moon.